Hey guys, it's Belle, and in this video we are going to be reading through and translating the 6th chapter of St. Paul's second letter to the Corinthians in the Gothic language. In the description of this video there will be a link to a playlist containing the earlier chapters of this video if you want to have a look at that. And as usual, if you want to pause the video and have a go at reading the Gothic on your own before I give you my translation, feel free to pause the video and write it out, and then you can check it against what I've written. And without further ado, let's get on with reading the Gothic. So, Gwarstwans jachthan bidiandans nis wari anst gudis niman iswis. So, these two nominatives here, one of these is a present participle, so it's standing in as a verb because we don't actually have an indicative verb in this clause or in this whole sentence, really. So, Gwarstwans is the collaborators. Than bidiandans is the ones who are asking. So in this case, we can translate it as a verb. We can unpack it into a verb. So I would translate this as, and we are asking as collaborators. And we know that, so that there's no word for we here, nor is this in any way indicative of first person, this bidiandans here. But it's masculine, nominative plural, and we know that it's Paul and Timothy who are writing this letter. They refer to themselves as we in the past. So from context, we can extrapolate it thus. So we as collaborators are asking, ni swari, not in vain. And then we have an accusative infinitive construction. So it's isves niman, we are asking that you not take up in vain, or receive. Or you can literally translate it as, we are asking you to not take ni niman, anstaguris, the grace of God, and then swari is in vain. So we as collaborators are asking that you not take up the grace of God in vain. Mela ok kwithith, under name anna hosidathus, yach indaga nasines gahalpthina. Se nu mail wella under name se, nu dags nasines. So we'll just do this kwithith here because this is like an insertion and it doesn't really relate to the rest of the clause. So he says, kwithith, mela ok under name. So in an agreeable and acceptable moment. And hosida, I listened thus to you. And this can also mean I obeyed, but in this case probably listen. Yach, in daga, and in the day, nasines, of salvation. Gahalp thina. So hilpan is one of those verbs that takes a genitive as its object. So thina here is almost certainly the object. So I helped you in the day. So technically, anhosida and gahalp can also mean he helped, so bear that in mind. But I think it's more likely to be I helped here. And then se, this is like look, behold, lo. It's not a verb, it's just a sort of particle that's put in there. Nu male wela undername. So now the moment wela undername is very suitable. So the well here is sort of similar to how we say it in some colloquial dialects of English, even to this day, like, oh, that's well good, innit? Kind of thing. Slipping back into the fragments of London I absorbed growing up. I'm far too posh to have absorbed much more. So, se, behold, nu dags nasines. Now it is the day of salvation. Ni en juntanu in wechte gibandans bistuqui. In ni anna wamjedo anbachti unsal. So, ni en juntanu in wechte gibandans bistuqui. So, gibandans, again, like the bidyandans, is probably, we can probably unpack it here as we are giving ni enuchun, nothing. And then I think this enuchu goes with bistunkwi. So bistunkwi is the genitive plural of stumbling blocks. Now, those of you who are really clued in your Gothic grammar might be a bit confused by this form because it looks like a feminine nominative singular form. such as you often get in verbs with abstract nouns, such as lutri. However, this is almost certainly a genitive plural, and the normal genitive plural form is this E letter here, which is the long E in Gothic, so it's the A sound in Gothic. And the EI diphthong in Gothic, it's actually pronounced as a long I, so it's E. So this is actually one of the interesting bits of evidence for how Gothic speakers were actually pronouncing their Gothic in a colloquial sense, and it indicates that the orthographic standards of Wulfila, although well maintained in the manuscripts that we have, because we have relatively few orthographic slip-ups in Gothic manuscripts compared to, say, Latin, and that might be because it's either more of a literary language for them, whereas orthographic mistakes in Latin manuscripts, you tend to see more of those in regions such as Romance-speaking areas where their native language is pretty close to Latin, and so they can more easily get confused with things. It's also possible that the Gothic manuscripts were copied more from examples rather than dictated from somebody reciting the text, as is the case for many Latin texts. So that's also an interesting explanation for why we have relatively fewer orthographic mistakes in Gothic manuscripts compared to Latin language manuscripts. However, this is one of those rare orthographic variants in the Gothic which shows how they were pronouncing things, and it shows us that at the time of Wulfila, the A and the E sound were very clearly distinct and people weren't getting them confused. But by the fifth century in Italy, or maybe even the sixth as well, when these Gothic Bible manuscripts such as the Codex Aureus were being written down, when they were pronouncing their Gothic, they were maybe pronouncing the A and the E as a similar sound, so maybe they were both E, because we see this confusion elsewhere in Gothic manuscripts. That's just a little tidbit on this particular variant and how it affects our understanding of Gothic pronunciation. Anyway, what it actually means is we are giving Givonans ni enhun, nothing, bistunqui, of stumbling blocks, or like causes for error, basically, is what they're meaning by this here. In werte means in any matter. E, and then so E, when we have a subjunctive verb afterwards, which anawamyedo is a subjunctive verb, it means it's a purpose clause. So we're not giving any cause of stumbling, so that anbachti unsar is our service may not be anawamyedo marred or, you know, tarred hard or obscured in some way. So I think what Paul and Timothy here are saying is that they're trying to be very thorough and careful in their letters so that they don't cause their service of God to be marred by errors that result from carelessness in how they're expressing their theology. So this verse here is indicating that the letters to the Corinthians and such they've been very carefully checked for their theological accuracy by Paul and Timothy. Ac in allama ustekjandans uns sue gudis anbachtos in stuitia managama in aglom in nothim in angwithom. Okay, so real quick, so this ustekjandans uns is we are the ones demonstrating ourselves, and then sue gudis anbachtos as the servants of God, and then we've got a ton for the next 1, 2, 3, basically for the next 3 verses. We have a whole list of dative prepositional clauses, all starting with in. So, right, let's go through them in order. So, but we are demonstrating ourselves as God's servants in alama, in everything. And then St. Paul is not content to just say everything. He has to go and list every specific thing. So, in stuitia managama, in great endurance, in alom, in tribulations, in nothim, in needs, in angwithom, which is in distresses, and then these ones here, in slachim, in karkarom, in unsutiam, in arbedim, in wop, Wockenim in Los Quithrin. So in Slachim is in afflictions, it could also mean in sort of beatings. In Carcaram, in prisons, and that's of course a known word from Latin carcer, which is an interesting thing that they've loaned that in, probably suggesting that the Goths prior to Christianization didn't, or maybe even prior to extensive contact with the Roman Empire, didn't really have in their society, such as the society that Saint Sabas the Goth lived in. They may not have had prisons per se, and they might have dealt with crime a different way. And given that prisons are a very urban thing, like a specific place where captives and prisoners are held, this makes more sense, in my opinion. I think there might be some references in early Germanic literature to hostages or prisoners being kept perhaps until dawn for execution, but I'm very fuzzy on that memory. But certainly they wouldn't be kept alive for very long, such that a prison would be necessary to house them. So anyway, so little explication on the word karkara there. So in beatings, in prisons, in unsutiam, which is in tumults, in arbedim, which is in labours, in wokenim, which is in vigils, and that's sort of related to the word woke in the present day, in los quithrin, which is in fasting. And I think this word's quite interesting. So quithri is, pretty sure is, or quithers maybe, is the word for stomach or belly, and los is the word for empty, related to modern German Laos and modern English loose. So the los quithrin is literally like empty stomach, which is interesting. I just like that as a word. And in verse 6, in chapter 6, verse 6, he says, in Subwicnithe, in Quinthia, in Langamodin, in Selin, in Achmin Wichama, in Freathwe, Unhindaruise. So in Subwicnithe is in purity or in chastity, in Quinthia is in knowledge, in Langamodin is in goodness or in kindness, in Langamodin, my mistake, is patience. In Saline is goodness and kindness, related to the word sales there. And Langamod's literally is sort of long-minded, so having long-lasting endurance, basically. In Achmin Wichama, in the Holy Spirit, in Friathwe Unhindarwise, so in sincere love. And I find this construction pretty interesting because Hindarwis is insincere. And then, so that it's literally insincere love, which I like. I've just given it in the gloss here as sincere love, because we don't need the double negative to confuse things here. And we have two more dative prepositional phrases beginning with in, and then we have a few prepositional phrases beginning with fer. So we've got even more prepositional phrases going all the way back to Us taken Yandans uns. What a joyful passage. So, in warda sunyos, in machtig gudes, ver huepna gerechtins texwona jach lidmona. So, in warda sunyos, in the word of truth, in machtig gudes, in the might of God, and notice that, because these two are contrasted, they're probably meant to be somewhat equivalent to each other. Verhuepna gerechtins texwona jach lidmona. So, ver is through, and then the wepna goes with both texwona and lidmona. So that's the weapons of both the right side and the left side. And these weapons are gerechtins, of righteousness. Because, of course, St. Paul, I think even either earlier or later in this same letter, describes arming oneself with the military equipment of God. So then, chapter 6, verse 8 reads, Verhulthu jach unswerin, verhwayamerin jach welamerin, swe erziandans jach sunine, swe unkunde jach ufkunnede. Jach ufkunnede. Goodness, that's a difficult one. All right, so verhulthu is through glory, jach verh unswerin, and through dishonor. Verhwayamerin, through, like, blasphemy, slander, speaking ill of someone. Yahweh mating, which is a good speech. So you might notice that it's based on meili as a, or meilings as a noun, and then that just means speaking or proclamation, and then why is sort of meaning bad, and then wella is good, related to the word well. So now we have some similar phrases, but they are prefaced with sway, and in this case we can translate it roughly as weather, really. So sway eriandansiach sunine, whether or as the ones who are misleading and as the true ones. So I wouldn't here translate this as we are misleading. I would just translate it as the ones who are in error and the ones who are correct. Sway unkunteach ufkunede. As unknown ones, and then ufkunede is like the ones who have been fully discovered. And the observant among you might note that the difference between unkunth and ufkunths in this case would literally be a single letter. So un versus uf, and the meaning is quite different. So Gothic can be weird like that. So then chapter 6 verse 9 is Sway gas wiltandans yach se libam. Se talside yach ni afdothide. So sway gas wiltandans, whether or even as we are dying, yach se livam, and behold, we live. Sway talside. So when I looked this up, I got educated ones, but I think what this means is the ones who are like appointed for death. I'm not certain on this, but just based on context and some other Germanic hints in my brain, I think that's what it means. Yachni afdothive, and not the ones who are exterminated. So it's what he's saying here is something that he said in previous chapters of this same letter, which is, we're dying physically, but we actually live, right, in the spiritual life. So then, chapter 6, verse 10 reads, Sway sorgandans it sintino faginondans, sway unlede ith margans gabigandans, sway ni wecht echandans yach alata disnimandans. So, sway sorgandans means as men who are grieving, it's sintino faginondans, but yet as men who are always faginons is rejoicing. Sway unleve as men who are poor, if managans gabigans, but nonetheless, don't think how to put this, enriching many. So gabigan is to enrich, and then managans is many men. So they are poor men, but nonetheless they're enriching many, and of course they're enriching them with like the gift of God, etc., etc. Sway ni wecht echandans, as men not owning anything, yach alata dis niemandans. And yet the men possessing alata is singular, so it's like everything, basically. And this dis preposition here at the front indicates totality or fully. So, the Christians have complete possession of all of the important things in life, is what this is saying. Muns unsar us luknada tu isvis, Corinthius, herto unsar us rumnada. So, muns unsar, our mouth, us luknada, it is unlocked or it is opened, du isvis, to you all, Corinthius, O Corinthians. Herto unsar, our heart, us rumnada, it is expanded. Ni thrichanda jus in uns, ith thrichanda in herthram Israel. So, may you guys not be troubled, ni thrichanda, in uns, in us. So this, we can probably translate it here as something like because of us or on account of us, or maybe even in our presence. Ith thrichanda in herthram Israel. But so this thrichanda could mean we are all troubled. That's the problem with the Gothic grammar here is thrichanda can go with yus, and because we have the yus pronoun here, we know for certain, right, that this is what it is. And Gothic is usually pro-drop, which means you don't need to include the pronoun because the verbal conjugations indicate which person and number is doing the actual action of the verb, and therefore you don't need the pronoun. So the fact that it's included here normally means that the pronoun is being included for emphasis. And because of that, I suspect that what this verse is meant to be doing is saying that you all don't worry on account of us. And then this three chana without a pronoun maybe is going to be taking Paul and Timothy as the the subjects of this verb, which would make sense because they're the sort of background authors of the essay, the letter. So you all don't worry about us, however, we will worry, because vis three chana would also work in terms of the grammar in herthram Israel, in your hearts, basically. So, don't worry, you guys don't worry, we will worry for you guys, basically. Athan thata samo andaloni swe frastim quita urum nethiachius. So, however, thata samo andaloni is that same reward. Swe frastim quita, just as we speak to children, urum nethiachius, may you guys also expand. So, I think what this is like, St. Paul and Timothy are teaching these things to the Corinthians as if speaking to children here, and then he's telling them to expand it as they go out and grow the Christian church in Corinth. So, in the same way that a child might grow into an adult, they're hoping that this reward in terms of God's grace and also Christian instruction that they're giving to the Corinthians will grow, and that these Corinthians, they will expand the reward that they've been given. Ni wertheth ga yukans ungalobiandam, unte huo delo garechtin mit ungarechtin, etho huo gamendothe liuchada mit requisa. So this is actually quite a famous verse which is echoed in a lot of medieval rhetoric in Latin later on. So let's tackle the first clause. Ni wertheth ga yukans. May you guys not become men who are defeated. Ungalobiandam, by those who are not believing. Unte huo delo, so since which of the parts, or basically what part, gerechtin mit ungerechtin, in righteousness with unrighteousness. So this is kind of difficult to give a direct translation of, but it's basically like, what does righteousness have to do with unrighteousness or with wickedness? So what does the fellowship of the light have to do with the shadows? And then huothan samaquise Christo myth belma etho huodele galobiandin myth ungalobiandin. So huothan samaquise, so which of the agreements Christo to Christ myth Belama with Belial. So basically, somebody who is agreeing with Christ, what business do they have agreeing with Belial, who is, I think, one of the old, maybe Babylonian deities, a pagan deity of some kind. And what part does a believer have with a non-believer? So that's, of course, linking back to what he said in verse 14, where he says, don't become somebody who is defeated by the unbelievers. So maybe this would imply don't join the unbelievers, because what business does a believer have with an unbeliever? Hochthan samaquise alchskudis myth galiugam. Unteguch jus alchskudis youth livandens. Quithith och guth, that he boinim yach inaganga yach wertha iseguth, yach is werthan mismanagi. So, huarthan samaquise, what then do the agreements alchs gudis myth galiugam. So the agreements I think this is of the altar rather than maybe a nominative. What part do the agreements of God's altar mitgaliuram with lies? Unteius achs gudis siuth. So, since you all are an altar achs gudis livandins of the living God, quithith och guth, God also says that he bawa in him, that I live in them or I dwell in them. Yach ina ganga, and I enter inwards. Yach huertha iseguth, and I become their God. Yach is werthand, and they become. Now remember that, like I said earlier, Gothic is pro-drop, so when they're including the pronoun, it's being done for emphasis. So, I enter into them and I become their God, and then they become Miss Manaki, a multitude for me. Now, a quick thing. So this miss here is what's called a dative of possession, and I may be inaccurately transferring knowledge of Latin to Gothic here, but in Latin, when the dative of possession is used, it more commonly is used to refer to something which is considered to be inalienable from the person itself. So you might say nomen me, to mean my name instead of nomen meum, because your name is inalienable from who you are as a person. And whereas, say, poculum meum is my cup, because that can be taken from me. There's more subtlety than just that, because it can also refer to something that's allotted to you in that particular instant, but that's the general gist. And so it's possible that the fact that this Gothic says miss instead of manari mina, which would be my multitude, expressed with a possessive pronoun, or a possessive adjective, I can't remember what the term for that is for mina, but this could be meaning to indicate that the multitude of God is inalienable from God in that sense, so indicating this greater degree of fastedness with God himself. Inach this usgangith us midame ise jach afskedith isvis, gwithith froya, jach unrenama ni ateket, jach ith andima isvis. So, inach this, on account of this, usgangith us midame ise, you will depart from the midst of them, out of the midst of them. So I believe this midst of them is probably referring to the ungalobjandin from the previous line. Yach afskedith isvis, and separate yourselves, so spread out. Quithith froya, the Lord says. Yach unrenama ni ateketh. So take on in Gothic, is it take on? I think it's take on in Gothic. As the root form of the verb, it takes a dative as its object. So may you not touch or relate to unrenyama, that which is unclean. And in this case, it's a dative, neuter, singular noun, so it probably, although it's technically like to an unclean thing, it probably is referring to just like any unclean thing in a general sense, because the dative adjectives on their own can sometimes do that. So don't get involved with unclean things or anything that's unclean. Yach ik andnima iswis, and I will receive you all, and I will take you guys up. Yach wertha iswis du atin, yach jus werthith mis du sunum, yach dotrum, quithith froya alawaldans. So, yach wertha, and I will become iswis for you all, du atin. Now, this would literally be translated as to the Father, and do normally does mean to or towards. In this particular context, it can also mean like as a father. So I will become as a father for you guys. We can maybe even translate it as I transform into or to a father for you guys. And you will become, and again they've included the pronoun for emphasis, you will become miss for me, du sunum dothrum. So you will become as sons and daughters for me. Quithith froya alawaldans, says the all-ruling Lord. And there we go. That is the end of Corinthians 2, chapter 6 in the Gothic language. I hope that's been useful for you guys in your learning of Gothic. If you want me to teach you Gothic or any of the other medieval languages I do on this channel, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description of this video. And I offer tuition in Gothic, Old English and Latin on there at lower than market rates. You can also join my Discord server where we have particular hidden channels for people who are interested in particular medieval languages that I do on my channel, and you can get some resources there and also ask questions. Until next time, like, comment, subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye everyone!